Imagine a single rejected sailor changing the destiny of 2 continents. In 1492, a man from Genoa set out not to discover America, but to find a shortcut to Asia. Instead, his voyage unleashed a wave of conquest, wealth, and devastation that reshaped the world in just 1 century. Within a few decades, empires would rise, civilizations would fall, and millions of lives would be changed forever. But how did it all begin? And why were Europeans suddenly so desperate to sail west across an unknown ocean? The story of colonization is not just about ships and maps. It's about greed, faith, rivalry, and the shocking encounters between worlds that had never met before. The spark, Columbus and Spain's timing. Christopher Columbus wasn't anyone's first choice. When he pitched his idea of sailing west to reach Asia, Portugal dismissed him as foolish and costly. But Spain was in a unique moment. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella had just expelled the last Muslim forces from Granada. Their treasury was full, their pride was high, and they were eager to expand their power. Columbus walked in at exactly the right time. That summer, he set sail with just 3 small ships, and 2 months later landed in the Bahamas. To Europe, it looked like the world had just doubled in size. Columbus thought he had reached the Indies, but what he really found was an entirely new world for Spain to claim. His diary reveals how he saw the native people, unarmed, unfamiliar with steel, and good servants who could be turned into Christians. For Spain, that meant opportunity. For the indigenous people, it meant disaster, and Columbus didn't stop there. When he returned in 1493, he brought a fleet of 17 ships, filled with settlers, priests, and soldiers. Colonization was no longer an experiment. It was official policy. But what pushed Europe to gamble everything on these dangerous voyages? The answer goes back decades before Columbus ever set sail. Why Europe looked west for centuries, Europe's lifeline to wealth came from the east. Silk, spices, ivory, and precious metals flowed along the Silk Road from China and India. But in 1453, everything changed. When the Ottoman Empire seized Constantinople, they seized control of that trade route. Suddenly, prices skyrocketed, and Europe's access to the east was strangled. The scramble was on for alternatives. Portugal led the way, sending ships around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. They became masters of navigation, charting new routes and building outposts along the African coast. But there was a problem. It was long, risky, and expensive. This is where Columbus's gamble looked so tempting. Instead of circling Africa, why not head west across the Atlantic? If his plan worked, Spain would not only bypass Ottoman taxes, but also leapfrog Portugal's dominance. And when Columbus stumbled onto the Bahamas, Spain realized it had something even bigger than trade routes, an entire new world to conquer. But Spain wasn't the only one with its eyes on the prize. A rivalry with Portugal threatened to erupt into all-out war, unless someone stepped in to draw a line across the ocean. Spain versus Portugal, the Treaty of Tordesillas. The news of Columbus's discovery spread like wildfire. Spain celebrated, but Portugal was furious. They had invested heavily in building sea routes around Africa, only to watch Spain suddenly leap ahead with brand new lands to the west. Conflict seemed inevitable. To avoid war between 2 of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, the Pope stepped in. In 1494, Pope Alexander VI drew an imaginary line down the Atlantic Ocean. Everything west of the line was Spain's. Everything east belonged to Portugal. This agreement became known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. At first, the deal looked like a victory for Spain. Columbus's islands, the Caribbean, and almost everything yet to be discovered in the Americas were now officially theirs. Portugal, meanwhile, was left to dominate Africa and Asia. But there was a twist. A massive stretch of land in South America, unknown at the time, fell just east of the line. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral stumbled upon it and claimed it for Portugal. That land was Brazil. Spain had the Caribbean and much of the Americas. Portugal had Brazil and Asia, and the race for colonization had begun. But the Spanish weren't content with islands and treaties. They were about to launch a wave of conquest that would shock the world. Spanish colonization explodes. Once Spain had its claim, expansion moved at lightning speed. Columbus's base on Hispaniola quickly became the first permanent European settlement in the New World. From there, Spain fanned out across the Caribbean. Puerto Rico was taken in 1508, Jamaica in 1509, and Cuba in 1511. Each island became a staging ground for bigger ambitions. Then, in 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa cut across Panama Panama and became the first European to lay eyes on the Pacific Ocean. He boldly declared the entire ocean and its shores as Spanish territory, a claim as shocking as it was audacious. But the real turning point came with Hernán Cortés. Stationed in Cuba, Cortés had heard whispers of vast empires and unimaginable riches across the mainland. Gold, silver, treasures beyond measure, all waiting in Mexico. In 1519, against the governor's orders, he launched his own expedition. What he found wasn't just wealth. It was the Aztec Empire, the most powerful civilization in Mesoamerica. Spain's ambitions were about to collide with one of the greatest societies the Americas had ever known. And what followed would be one of the bloodiest and most devastating clashes in history. The fall of the Aztecs. When Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Yucatan in 1519, he faced a world unlike anything Spain had ever seen. The Aztec Empire, centered in the dazzling city of Tenochtitlan, was rich, organized, and deeply entrenched in its traditions. But Cortés had advantages the Aztecs had never encountered. His men carried steel swords and guns, weapons far deadlier than obsidian blades. They rode horses the Aztecs had never seen and brought war dogs trained to kill. Yet Spain's most devastating weapon was invisible: disease. Smallpox tore through the Aztec population, leaving entire communities weakened before battles even began. Despite fierce resistance, the Spanish pushed forward. In 1521, after brutal fighting and mass devastation, Tenochtitlan fell. The city was razed, its temples destroyed, and on its ruins, Spain built Mexico City. It was the end of the Aztec Empire, a civilization undone not just by conquest, but by sickness it had no defense against. By Spain's count, nearly 250,000 Aztecs perished in the struggle. Half of them died not from swords or muskets, but from the plagues that followed the Europeans. The conquest of Mexico proved that Spain could topple even the mightiest empires of the New World. And soon they turned their gaze even farther south, to the mountains of Peru, where another empire ruled an even larger domain. What happened there would rival the destruction of the Aztecs and cement Spain's grip on South America. The conquest of the Inca Empire. South of Mexico, another empire dominated the Andes, larger, wealthier, and more organized than even the Aztecs. The Inca Empire stretched across 1.8 million square kilometers, from Ecuador down into Chile. Roads, cities, and terraces carved into mountains showed a society at its peak. But in 1532, the Spanish arrived, led by Francisco Pizarro. The timing could not have been more disastrous for the Incas. A brutal civil war had just torn the empire apart, leaving rival brothers fighting for the throne. Disease, carried over long before the Spaniards themselves, had already begun to weaken the population. Pizarro exploited the chaos. With only a few hundred men, he lured Emperor Atahualpa into a meeting, then ambushed his forces. Guns and steel cut down thousands who had no defense against European weapons. Atahualpa was captured, held for ransom, and eventually executed despite paying in gold and silver, a betrayal that shattered Inca resistance. In just a few years, Spain claimed Peru and the vast silver mines of Potosi, a resource so rich it would fuel Europe's rise for centuries. With Mexico and Peru under its control, Spain now dominated nearly all of South America, except for Portugal's Brazil. But Spain's victories couldn't go unnoticed forever. Rival powers in Europe, France and England, were watching closely, eager to carve out their own pieces of the New World. Rivals enter. France and England, Spain and Portugal seemed unstoppable. But across Europe, other powers were itching to join the race. France struck first. In 1534, Jacques Cartier crossed the Atlantic, explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and claimed land in what would later become Canada. He dreamed of building New France, but harsh winters, hostile encounters with native tribes, and weak support back home doomed the early colonies. England moved more cautiously, but when Queen Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, everything changed. She unleashed privateers to raid Spanish treasure ships and backed expeditions to claim land of her own. In 1584, Walter Raleigh received a charter to establish a colony in North America. A year later, settlers landed on Roanoke Island, off present-day North Carolina. But when supply ships returned, the settlement had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no battle, only the word Croatoan carved into a post. The fate of the lost colony remains a mystery to this day. These early French and English attempts were shaky, but they proved one thing: Spain's dominance would not go unchallenged forever. Rival empires were coming, and with them, centuries of conflict in the New World. Yet while Europeans fought over territory, the people who suffered most were those who had lived in the Americas for thousands of years, native populations and slavery. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, European arrival was nothing short of catastrophic. At first, encounters were filled with curiosity and caution, but it didn't take long for the balance to turn brutal. The Spanish enslaved native populations on Hispaniola, forcing them to work in mines and plantations. When disease swept through and wiped out entire communities, colonists looked elsewhere for labor. That search led across the Atlantic to West Africa. Thus began one of history's darkest chapters, the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were captured, shipped in chains, and sold into lives of back-breaking labor in the New World, in fields of sugar in Brazil, in silver mines of Peru, and on plantations in the Caribbean. Enslaved men and women replaced native populations who had been decimated by conquest and plague. Religion played its part, too. Missionaries preached Christianity as the only true faith, pressuring natives to abandon their traditions. Some priests defended indigenous rights, warning that they were human souls, not beasts. But for most colonists, profit outweighed compassion. By the end of the 16th century, native civilizations lay shattered, their lands controlled by foreign crowns, their people either enslaved, converted, or dead. What had begun as a search for spices and trade routes had turned into a system of conquest, colonization, and slavery that reshaped the Americas forever. But even after just one century, this was only the beginning. The map of the New World was still being drawn, and the rivalries that started here would ignite global empires in the centuries to come. Conclusion. In just 100 years, the Americas were transformed beyond recognition. Spain stretched its empire from Argentina to Florida, fueled by silver, gold, and conquest. Portugal carved out Brazil, building sugar plantations that would reshape global trade. France and England made their first shaky steps, planting seeds that would grow into future rivalries. But behind the maps and treaties lay a darker reality. Indigenous civilizations that had thrived for centuries were shattered. Disease erased millions. Entire cultures were forced into slavery, converted under pressure, or erased altogether. And as European crowns grew richer, the first ships carrying enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic, beginning a legacy of suffering that would last for centuries. The colonization of the Americas was not a single event. It was a chain reaction of ambition, greed, faith, and violence. What started with Columbus's small fleet in 1492 had, by 1592, redrawn the world's balance of power. And this was only the beginning. The rivalries sparked in the 16th century would erupt into wars, revolutions, and new nations. The world we know today was forged in those first 100 years of colonization, a story of glory for some and devastation for countless others. Thanks for watching. If you found this story of colonization as shocking and eye-opening as I did, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we've got more untold stories of history coming your way. What part of this first century of colonization surprised you the most? Columbus's gamble, the fall of mighty empires, or the mystery of Roanoke? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And until next time, keep exploring the past, because history is never just history. It's the story of how we became who we are today.